Monday.
How are you doing, sir, on this blustery day?
I'm doing pretty well. It's not as blustery here in Philly as it was yesterday. We've got a little cold snap, but then it's supposed to get back in the 50s. So it seems like spring's trying to happen, which is fun.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's happening here now. It's the junipers.
Yeah.
So I actually went into my van and there was this powder on my seat. I'm like, that's weird. And then I realized it was the pollen and the wind that was just had its way through the crack in my door, and it just all ended up in this one place. Sticky kind of.
Yeah.
But yeah, the spring is here.
That'll get you sneezing. So I was thinking, um, before we did the recording with Claudia, we had kind of put bookends, more or less, on kind of a worldview, right? That involved the semantic world and phenomenology and hermeneutics and some methodology around, a multimodal approach to meaning making and things like that. And we talked about examining things moving forward from the standpoint of that worldview as potentially a way to help make it more accessible for folks. And I was watching the Trump and Vance and Zelenskyy conversation. I don't know if you saw that, but it kind of blew up on the internet because they all got pretty bent out of shape. And I thought it sort of represents at least elements of philosophical threads that we've been talking about. And I thought it might be a way to talk about how politics is philosophy showing up in governance and in you know the external world. So in particular, there's sort of this moral position that Zelensky wanted to hold, and that I think a lot of Americans also hold, that Putin, as the aggressor, was morally wrong and caused untold deaths and violated international law, yada yada, and that was the basis for how the United States should intervene. And Trump and Vance seem to come from potentially, at least on some level, a utilitarian place, which kind of seemed to say doesn't really matter who started it. We don't see an end to it. And so we're going to make business deals to end it instead of trying to adjudicate a moral um, high ground for one party or another. And I know that utilitarian might only describe one aspect of that because utilitarian doesn't mean business deal, and Trump definitely seems to be pushing this minerals deal with Ukraine, and I'm sure he's doing some business and or political deal with Putin, on the other side. So it's not just utilitarian, but I thought, well, that there are these two different worldviews maybe conflicting there. And I was curious to get your take on what you saw there, maybe through a philosophical lens.
Yeah. Um, well, through the philosophical lens of pragmatism, I guess I feel myself, at least my first instinct is to try to look at it maybe from a Sun Tzuian angle. And I think before we described the situation of a certain Roman general who had besieged a town, and then other forces friendly to the town came up on his rear, so he had a wall around the town, and then he had a wall to his rear, keeping the rescuing forces from attacking. So he had the outer challenge. He needed an outer strategy and outer defense to handle that facet. Meanwhile, he needed one on the inside, and we sort of use that as a metaphor. for a politician, because the politician has party politics, which is how they get in power. But then they have the bigger political game, whether if they're representing a nation in international politics, or a state within national politics, or a county within state politics. There's always the outside, and the forces coming from the outside, and then there's the inside and the forces coming from the inside. So I think when we get to the international level, that model becomes only informative to a limited degree, because we start getting into really complex systems. And in the particular case of America, you would say you have the party as a force to be reckoned with, but you also have the people and public opinion as a force to be reckoned with. So there's a defense and a strategy to handling that. There's a defense and a strategy to handling the party internal. There's one to the outside political forces. And so one always has to ask oneself, is what I'm seeing something that was cooked up specifically to serve to the public for handling that issue? Or is what we're seeing a response to something on the inner workings of the power playing within that clan? Or are we seeing something that really is a legitimate game in the chess game on the international level? And I think that anything that happens almost has to simultaneously be all three of those. So that's why I think a lot of times things don't make sense from what the public is served up. Uh, and I think that that's why we have this entire field of so-called conspiracy theory or misinformation, or but the guy that second sprang to mind next to Sun Tzu to understand what was going on was Machiavelli, who I think we haven't mentioned uh, in the podcast yet. But Machiavelli sort of represents this idea of it's sometimes expressed as realpolitik, how things really work, which might be different than the story that is being told about what's really happening and why it's supposedly working the way it is. And Machiavelli says some pretty shocking things to the more idealistically oriented things, like saying, well, as his piece is called "The Prince," and it's his counsel to a prince, uh, uh, presumably soon to be or someday to be a king. And he counsels him, in one case, he says a man has to either be your friend or you kill him, you annihilate him. There's no room for leaving enemies counter to you out there operating. And of course, he's talking about this very real situation of nested series of concerns, and the real solution somehow having to satisfy all of those. So a secondary question that I would have is anybody really operating out of a philosophical foundation, or is that primarily window dressing? Uh, so are we going to bring the world democracy, or are we going to recognize that democracy is a natural stage of development that cultures and societies have to grow into? Are we going to tear people out of their natural state of development and all of a sudden make them wear suits and ties? And we did that, and we called it colonialism. There's still an argument that rages today. Were they better off, or were they not better off? Were they better off culturally intact, or with modern medicine and now as taxpayers? So there's a real question there, and particularly, I think you and I both, because we've had direct experience with the artifacts of civilizations that were still in an archaic state, which is to say the whole shamanic world of things, I think we both might agree that there's a danger of the baby going out with the bathwater whenever we force our our picture of what's the right way to do things on other people. And this is also that ethical conversation. Uh, the consequentialist would say, well, less of their babies are going to die if we convert them all to our religion and our economic system and so then since more babies will suffer less, we should just go in and just annihilate their culture and make them think everything like we think because we think we have a higher infant uh, survivability rate. That's almost akin to the argument of if we have four people that need organs, do we harvest organs on one healthy person to save the four who need the organs? Like, well, it depends on who you ask. A lot of these questions depend on who you ask, and uh, so so yeah, philosophically, it's hard, and I think that I don't presuppose to know what's really going on. I just know certain things that come out of the hermeneutic, the heuristics of the patterns, and that is somehow it's going to cost me freedom and it's going to cost me money, whatever these guys are cooking up, because it always does. That seems to be, and that remember, if we go back to the rich conversation, that seems to be the left right conversation going back to the kings. How much is
Well,
centralized power? How much is individualized power? How much wealth stays with the people? How much does the king get to own?
I think there is a philosophical underpinning to that, though, and so if a society or a king understands philosophical value in terms of freedom of thought and freedom of thought is going to result in some individual and therefore collective evolution that's good. And so the rules of society need to be set up so that that freedom is somehow maximized. And I think the United States is to some extent an experiment in that philosophical direction.
Everything since the Magna Carta.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so maybe the question to you is rather than what philosophical threads do you see at play in this exchange? You're kind of saying, well, I don't know if these are philosophical threads; they're maybe more tactical. In what way is politics an expression of philosophy? Because I guess I was seeing that even with these layers of tactics, there's a worldview being expressed by the decisions that are being made and the platforms and policies that are made. So in order
Sure.
to keep these nested layers of constituents happy enough to keep you in power, you have to align with them philosophically in some way also.
With some of them, at least.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are a lot of people on X saying it's about time we stopped spending billions of dollars on an unwinnable war, or we have to give Ukraine enough resource to actually win the war and not just trickle money in and kind of bleed ourselves and his army dry.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's philosophy buried in there
Right.
somewhere.
Yeah. I think that philosophy, if we're going to make a deterministic math formula out of this, the the philosophy factor would be multiplied by some other factor that might be a morality or an ethics factor, so that uh, because I think it really does come down to ethical judgments in on the in the place of people who are in positions of power to do what's right or what's not right. And maybe the philosophy translates into the system eventually. But, this is an old question. This goes all the way back to Aristotle, right? In the six different forms of government and where power lies. Because once power lies in a certain place, see, we have to realize that reason is all well and good, but reason is a complete whore. If I have a psychological predisposition, like that I really should have power and other people really shouldn't, then I can set reason to work on that task. Then I can cook up every kind of thing from God says that to here, look at my math that I've done over disease and infant mortality. You're much better if I control your life than if you control your life. Like there's a big spectrum there. And I don't think any of it's honest. Right. And maybe this is part of what we spoke about with Claudia, this drive to totalize. Because it is, Nietzsche had this idea of the will to power. And when we come up with these systems of government, we're trying to come up with systems that power monger proof our political life. And so it's like we're we're trying to make sausage and we got a bunch of wild dogs around. So how much good sausage is going to come out of it and how much is just going to get pulled off the table by the fucking wild dogs, right? I mean, that's a sloppy metaphor, but I think sausage making has been applied to this whole process before me. And I think that, for example, with the Ukraine thing, I think that if we had a system and we knew where every dollar went, just like because of God or AI, if we could track where every dollar went, we'd be having an entirely different conversation. And it would be one about morality in high places. It wouldn't be one about philosophy. It would be one about the philosophy being the foundation for the sound bites used to market the narrative that they need to have marketed so they get to do what they want to do because they know better and you're a plebe anyway, so fuck you. Is
Yeah, I
that
mean, I think
is
it's
that too
safe to
cynical?
assume. Well, I no, and I mean, it makes me want to continue trying to answer the question. Maybe the next question is, well, how do you differentiate philosophy from morality from ethics? Because I guess to me, those all kind of there's a Venn diagram there where they're
A lot of
describing
overlap.
similar things.
Yeah, you need Marcus Aurelius's, really. I mean, I think that this is one of the challenges of this is exactly why Plato said you need philosopher kings in charge. Because how we work this all out together is a tricky thing. And the one thing we pretty much can rule out, even though we don't have the answer, we can pretty much rule out the idea of letting the biggest pigs pig out on anything that they can possibly pig out on. So that was a rock and roll reference today. Heads down in the pig mine saying, keep on digging, What do you hope to find? What do you hope to find, right? And we know where it ends. It ends with
You have to make the attribution to Pink
the
Floyd.
the bad blood turning to stone. Yeah. And this is, of course, dogs. Uh, Now I love dogs, but not this kind, right? And
I
there's
like
also
friendly
reference to a
dog.
few different sorts of porcine individuals as well on that album called Animals by Pink Floyd. Don't miss it. If you haven't heard this, I mean, please.
So it's not. You wouldn't say it's just a bad philosophy that results in the pigs at the trough eating as much as they can, leaving nothing for the rest. That's not even philosophy.
I'm not sure I'm not sure that there's enough of the overcoming of the basic human desire, that will to receive, It just could be just too animalistic of a centering of consciousness, and maybe we're looking for a 100th monkey, and a lot of philosophers have pointed this out. For example, you know, one of Heidegger's big work was called Das Sein und Zeit, right? Being in the world and time. And he talks about temporality, and we have this idea of time as a stack of this moment and the next moment and the next moment, and it just goes on to infinity, right? But he's like, bullshit. He says that's not any human's experience of time. The one thing we know as humans is that our time is not infinite. Our time is finite, and that changes everything. And that should change. I mean, he's speaking to our attaining authenticity, right? And, the Chinese have this idea, Shaorun, little people, right? For Heidegger, it's being confused with being with the small b, meaning all the things, all the individual beings, and not authentically engaging with what it means to be a human at a time and a place, right? So I would say, like, there's a great St. John's College story that's about the campus back in the 60s, back in Maryland. And the Black Panthers actually occupied the dean's office. Now, I've only got you have read a written account of this, but they asked him, what's going on? This was the 60s and civil rights, and there was so much concern about injustice and how do we live together correctly, and all of that. And they ask him, you're the philosopher guy, head of the philosophy business here, what's the deal? And you know what his answer was? Original sin. And I think they just got up and left the office. What do you do with that? Right? And that's why I've said before in another way, I've said that I think that when the virtue quotient is high enough, any system will work.
Yeah.
And when the virtue quotient is too low, no system will work.
Yeah.
But if it's low enough, we'll end up with whips and cages. I mean, that's
There
just
might
where it goes.
I do think that some systems might self-regulate with less virtue better than others, maybe just based on certain historical outcomes. But I want to
I
go
agree.
back to philosophy and politics because I'm still kind of stuck on the idea that politics is an expression of philosophy, even if not a great one. So like the thing we were talking with Rich about the left and right, uh, or how much should power be centralized versus distributed, or another frame is how much should individual rights be prioritized over the collective good, or vice
Right,
versa.
right.
And
And a lot of
it
those are
just has
problems
those
of
kind of effects.
scale. A lot of those are problems of scale.
Yeah. So I'm still wanting to fish for when is how do you know if the politics you're witnessing and experiencing is philosophical or not? And I guess you propose that if you see in it the will to bestow, not just the will to receive, it might be philosophy.
Although that's really a question because it depends on what you want to bestow and who it belongs to originally. In all fairness. uh, no, I think that there is a big mystery here that I've always sort of felt for my as a youth, and I originally I felt it not as the problem of solving a dysfunction. I saw it more as a question of how do we bring to light all of the potential? How do we create a setting that is ideal for children to be raised in, so that the children that get raised in that setting have all of their petals unfolded? How do we build a world that then supports that gives people what they need, that encourages them in the right directions? Because we have this curiosity where some people suffer from not enough, and other people actually suffer from too much, which is a hard thing for a lot of people to realize. But Thoreau told us about that. He felt this so strongly. The way he said it was, he said, to be born rich is to be stillborn. But I think we've all seen that. We all know that, for example, there are people that will spend $500 on a bottle of wine or a bottle of champagne, and they know full well that we could feed a village for a while for $500 in East Africa, or places where humans are really, through no real fault of their own except being born there, where they're having a very hard time. So, it's like there's a relativity thing, and this we've had the conversation before about where is the line between us and them? Is it us humans? Is it us English speakers? Is it us New Mexicans? And where that us and them line gets drawn seems to affect the psychology. If you remember the story of the guy getting pushed off the bridge because the us line wasn't in the right place.
Or eventually it got crossed. It always does.
It always does, right. And that's like that same idea of the Russian dolls, the nested series of concerns. And by the time we get to political life, there's so many structures inside that are tugging and pulling different ways that we get this ship that's very difficult to steer and very difficult to stop or to move or to even keep real track of. And it could be, I understand a lot of the gnashing of teeth around Doge, but I also understand the way time influences institutions and organizations and
And their ossification, you mean?
their ossification and also their cancer-like potential if they tap into a good vein or artery of resource.
Or their ability to become cancerous when ideologically captured.
And then that resource kind of becomes fuel uh,
Yeah.
for the whole structure. And I
For the
think these are
ideology.
the kinds of things where, are there honest mistakes? Are there dishonest mistakes? There's a question. I mean, I'd like to see, and this is a fantasy thing, what it would be like if I was only looking at honest mistakes. Like if I could see everything going exactly the way it's supposed to be going, but the virtue was dialed way up. Like, how much would that change things? Like, would the people that are starving get fed just because, hey, look,
Let's
you
pause
know?
there. Based on the conversations we've had about things like karma, what do you think would happen if so so I, so there's that, right? If all the mistakes were honest mistakes. I also think it brings up a conversation that I think we've had on on the podcast about whether dividing people into good people and bad people is even possible, because aren't the bad people just acting out trauma, right? So yeah, what do you think would happen if you follow that experiment, and you only got honest mistakes?
Yeah. Well, presumably Doge would be out of business.
Well, but honest mistakes could result in waste, bad processes, bad.
Oh, they can. They can. I
Yeah,
think there'd probably still be 5 to 7% left.
because I think corruption is kind of like the icing and maybe the sizzle, but the steak is just bureaucratic ossification.
Unless the stake is a war and it was some fundamental dishonesty in the seats that push the button to say, "Yeah, let's do the war."
Of course, that happens. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that there are some dynamics that don't have to be personalized to see how they work, whether it's AI at the healthcare systems or it's IG Farben and its role in World War II, or that that certain structures get to certain points, and we spoke about this with Claudia, where the morality sort of gets accumulated and all put in one place where one person can dispense with it, can make the moral judgment. If he makes the wrong moral judgment, then they decide, well, he wasn't the right guy for that job. If you remember that story of interrogating the prisoner. And so the argument might be made then that there's something happening in the structure that's demoralizing or amoralizing, immoralizing the activity of the greater. And then we see, we can see Luigi as a specific instance of a generic type of response
That's a
to this mechanization of scale that grinds people up like powder.
it's an interesting point because one of my reactions in seeing it's kind of like the Crowley poem, right? First they laughed and they cried, then they laughed and they cried. Like the reactions are like very one-sided. It's about time we stopped wasting money on this travesty. Or the kind of total bleeding heart. Zelenskyy is good and Putin is evil, or Ukraine is good and Russia is evil, and we have to be on the side of good, not evil. And
And this all
kind of
started,
both
and
are over.
nothing happened before in 2014 that would
Yeah,
cause any of this. There was never any.
they're both oversimplified.
Yeah,
And that your point about morality being outsourced to as few people as possible is really interesting. I wonder um, if that goes to your point earlier about a problem of scale, and if we had kind of more a small is beautiful model for our politics, would morality by default be better distributed? Because we've got like 535 representatives, and then some number of judicial branch and executive branch employees, and
right,
that's where we're putting our morality.
right. Yeah, or if we make a law that says that if you're going to sit on a board of directors or a position of political office, you are going to push you through this morality box, and it's going to burn out any of the impurities in your brain that will cause you to do fucked up stuff. And then again in these thought experiments, how much would life change? What if, because I come back to Confucius and the Datung, the Great Achievement Society, uh, and because whether the king is a king or the king is a group of 500 people doing some dance between themselves to come up with the conclusion, the question really remains the same. He said that in the beginning, the creation of the Datung, the Great Achievement Society, where everyone was taken care of, and all the able-bodied had work, and all the elderly and the handicapped were taken care of, and I believe the emperor would plow. So there was this. The idea was that the emperor was making decisions in the best interests of the people, and everything was chill. Everything was in harmony with the Tao. And then came the times when the emperors made decisions, the rulers made decisions based on their own self-interest and not on the best interests of the people. And things began to part from the way, but they were ashamed and they hid it. And while things began to part from the way, they did not part greatly. And then came the time when they decided they would make their decisions based on their own best interests, and they were not ashamed. And they didn't hide it from the people. And it went for a while till the wheel came off the cart. And the people rose up and they chopped their heads off and they put them on stakes and they danced them through the streets, paraded them through the streets. And the next dynasty was set up. And then a period of land redistribution, period of 2 to 700 years of peace follows until you get basically back to the same situation. And you have Lao Tzu telling people like, well, once the people no longer fear death, you're not going to control them. So you better not make their lives suck so bad by robbing them and manipulating them that they no longer care to live, because then they will come for you.
If politics operates cyclically like that, do you have a mental model for how to reconcile that with consciousness still evolving? So, like going from a mythic to an archaic to a rational to a post-rational or cycloptic worldview. How are we still going through the same political cycle, or does it have different meaning as we go through it in those different stages?
I think there's a word for it, but it escapes me right now. Concatenation, maybe. There's a way that there's cycles, but it's moving through a structure that's growing
Hmm.
and it's evolving as it does that. And that's where I've referred before to the idea of the dog is moving in its own direction and the fleas are on the dog trying to steer the dog. And sometimes it looks like it's going the way they want, and sometimes it doesn't, and they're tugging at hairs. And sometimes the dog just and you're gone, right? Well, the dog is human evolution or the evolution of human culture or whatever. And sometimes people feel they can steer it, and sometimes it goes and they're gone. And but the dog seems to have an idea where it's going, maybe more than any of us fleas do. And so, like, we see these series of revolutions. And, I've mentioned before this idea of the role of the individual changing through history. So we look at, say, the Gutenberg Revolution, where before that, you didn't have access to the Bible. You couldn't read it anyway. And there were priests, and that was their job. And they'd look in there and they'd say, "Oh yeah, it says, yeah, I'll be doing the hermeneutics for you, right?" And then there goes their own personal authority over their lives, right? Well, then this Gutenberg guy comes in, and now everybody's got a Bible, and the next thing you know, son of a gun, you got Martin Luther, and he's nailing these things, these arguments. That's the problem with free speech, right? And that's why they put this in to try to powermonger proof the whole thing. Because when you have free speech and you try to put out a narrative that you use to boondoggle everybody and to grab control, there's always somebody that's going to go, "Hey, hey." And it's like, well, those guys, you got to shut them up. Those are the guys that stand in front of your tanks in Tiananmen Square. Those are the people that don't go to Vietnam when you tell them to go to Vietnam. Those are the people that refuse to pay for wars that they weren't told the truths about. There's definitely a theme through history here. And so manipulating and now we can see we're not just looping here. The internet, the fact that we're having this conversation across a country, this is a game changer. Remember Dostoevsky? When he was young, he was caught with a printing press. And I don't think he ever recovered from this because they put him in front of a friggin' firing squad. They gave him the last cigarette that blindfolds down over his eyes, and then somebody comes and they don't shoot him, right? So there's no capturing people with this printing press. This printing press is loose, and they know it. And that means that's why we have to have misinformation, because we can't have people just parsing this out from themselves by having dialogues, or they may figure things out and they may decide that they're getting played. I mean, and so historically, it's like, well, we don't want them. In fact, we even want to restrict when they can gather and how large a group, because they'll be filling each other in. That was, there were laws around that. So this is, again, though, this is that same conversation that made half the room sit on the right side of the king and half the room sit on the left side of the king. How much does the king get to know? How much does he not get to know? This is also where we get all these dystopic science fiction. How does technology go, for us or against us? And and I think that we're in that, we're engaged in that right now, that arms race of, I think I mentioned last time, the idea of waking up from history. Well, this is something that happens in each individual, you know? Even if we look at, what Heidegger was encouraging people to do. Ironic, he ended up a Nazi, but that's another story. But it was this idea of striving to authenticity by basically, stepping up to what it means to be a human being and not just trapped in the world of insignificant stuff and
Let's pause there for a sec because I do find like throughout history there are these paradoxical situations where somebody's philosophy or art or something is, it seems like it's right on. They seem like they're really clear and they're tapped into something deep, and then they end up being a Nazi. What do you think about Heidegger understanding that human authenticity exists, and that the work is to reveal and express it, and then choosing Nazism as a way to, I guess, reveal and express his own authenticity? Like, what is
right.
that?
Well, his big teacher was Edmund Husserl, who was Jewish.
Yeah,
Some of his students who followed in his footsteps, that is to say, using his method, were Jewish.
like Levinas.
Like Levinas, exactly. And, and there were others, French and other people that had plenty of bones to pick with the Nazis too. Uh, and yeah, you have to wonder how that happens. And I don't know that I have enough of the facts to do it hermeneutical justice, right? And by hermeneutical, I mean to have enough of the background to be in the head of the person when that decision was produced.
Yeah.
Or the degree to which I just don't have any of the facts around that. Uh, but it sort of reminds me of some other intellectuals that have fallen for some of the things that are just as egregious as, well, maybe not just as egregious, but nearly so, as far as the misinformation content that have just gone all in.
Yeah.
And some, and in some cases, I think it was because they were like 80 years old and they just lost the plot. So
Yeah,
that the
or a
thing,
blind spot. Because you're reminding me, like, um, I, I've had, I had a teacher who had tremendous experience doing ayahuasca ceremonies. And when you do a lot of ceremonies, you get exposed to a lot of moral questions and a lot of questions about what is good and what is not good in my life and which do I choose, right? And when it came to certain topics, he just wouldn't wouldn't seem to choose the right path. Like around choosing women that were going to be healthy partners, and really drive bounty in his life. Those just weren't the women he chose. He chose women that brought a lot of drama into his life, and obviously he brought drama into their lives as well.
you know,
And it always struck me as odd that that remained a blind spot for decades of, doing thousands of ceremonies.
because his foot was nailed down.
Yeah. And so
And
Heidegger's foot must have been nailed down in some Nazi way.
or some fearful way.
Well, that's what
Did you ever hear the about or read the play by Eugene Ionesco called Rhinoceros? It's one of these amazing things, and I think it was written particularly for Zero Mostel, famous actor back in the day. And it's about the spread of Nazism. And it's exactly that question of how could people that you've known your whole life all of a sudden fall for this. Uh, I mean, feel like in the past 3 years, we saw some pretty similar behavior.
Yeah, and on a number of fronts. I mean, my association with that is the post October 7th anti-Semitism. I assume you're referring to COVID.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But just that we saw that retribalization and fear being used as part of it. Well, the basic idea of rhinoceros is our two protagonists were hanging out, and they're at a coffee shop, and just a normal day in Paris or something like that. And then lo and behold, what comes thundering through the streets is a rhinoceros, which freaks everybody out, as it should be, right? But then it happens more and more. And then the great scene that was made for Zero Mostel is it's the two friends that are in his apartment, and he keeps going in and out of the bathroom. And in the bathroom, they've got the makeup guy in there. And each time he comes out, he talks, his voice is a little rougher. And by the time, before your eyes on the stage, he transforms into a friggin' rhinoceros. And our hero, our true protagonist, who is the one who's going, well, how's everybody? It's just as crazy as if people started turning into rhinoceros. This was, of course, the theater of the absurd, uh, which was in that reaction period to, because I mean, look at what just happened, right? We had all this promise, as we spoke about with Claudia. We had all this promise of the the engineering revolutions that brought in railroads and electricity, and I mean all this stuff. We had expos, world fairs to check out all the new cool shit and how much life is going to be different. And then we have this horrific nightmare thing happen. Well, obviously everything's absurd. We talked about the meaning of absurd last time, I think, and this idea of the irrational that's always left over that we can't put into an integer.
Mhm.
There's always that piece, that slice that we can't quite fit into the reasonable, and we call them irrational numbers, right? But the irrational just seems to be written into the script somehow.
Mhm.
And I think that the argument is that only moral virtue can, there were people. There's that great photo of the crowd of everybody
Yeah.
saluting, and there's the one dude that's just like "fuck you," right? Well, I think that there is something about that, and that's why I like Joyce so much, because Joyce is about seeing the heroic in the everyday. And I think the answer to this is each person has to be tuned in, turned on, and willing to be heroic for what they know to be correct. And
And willing to be open-minded to update their idea of what's correct at the same
well,
time.
that has to be part of it. That's
Yeah.
that's the most important part of the heroicism is the self-explanatory or the self-exploratory part that pulls that nail up. Right. And then some of these philosophers, they get very much into this idea of freedom, that we only really attain freedom when we're in that authentic state.
Mm.
That until that time, we're just ping pong balling around
That's
here.
another application of this metaphor of the general besieging a city and then getting besieged himself, and there being the internal and the external, because so much we think about freedom from our external circumstances, from unjust laws or onerous relationships, or but what you're describing is freedom from our own beliefs that no longer serve. Freedom
Right.
from our foot being nailed down to the floor in that particular way.
Updating and stretching that cognitive model so that our process, because that's what our process is run on. So, that famous saying, garbage in, garbage out. If your processes might be running fine, but if all their premises are old and unupdated, then you're going to get garbage out.
Yeah.
And I mean, when we see it in others, we see it. It's hard to see in ourselves. But yeah, no, that's why I think that the problem of the future won't be solved by other people. And that's why I say that our philosophy is what we have to live. We have to live out of our philosophy. That's how the manifestation changes. And and I don't think it's meant to be something that we just waltz right into, honestly.
L-
I
l-
mean, I think there
l-
is that process of collective karma, and all this is all learning and churning up awareness of all these things. This is again the idea of the one knowing itself by going through all this.
Let's say a little more about morality. I guess I interpreted what you just said as we need to transition from centralizing morality with relatively few people to individual ownership of morality. Um, does that have a political implication, or is it
Probably democracy.
post-political? Pr- Uh, demo- Democracy. So even though the founding fathers said things about democracy to the effect of it just creates gridlock and pulls you down to kind of the lowest common denominator, and we need representational government, not pure democracy.
Well, that's what I mean. The idea of representational of something, as opposed to just representational of the king's whim. That
Well, but we
that
have
and
that.
what
We have that today, no?
Well, at one end of that slider, we have all the power residing in the one person,
Yeah.
and he gets to wear a special hat, and then we
That's how
try
you
to
know.
slide it, right? And we try to slide it all the way down to the other end, and we get, everybody has power, and the problem becomes, instead of the guy with the big hat having crazy ideas, the fact that we know that, if we give it to everybody, there's a lot of people out there that are, pushing on the pull doors.
At best.
Yeah, and so we have to take that into account somehow. But I think the obvious implication in this is that if we're slid towards the more and more people having a say, then the future depends on education. That that to me seems like a very reasonable and obvious conclusion. And so that's also what I see coming out of the interweb. Yes, I know there's people that are doing silly things and putting out untruths and all that, but it's not like that's new. They didn't invent that, right? There's been all sorts of silly stuff all this whole time. As one of the people from the before the internet, I will testify silly shit ain't new. And there were people out there peddling it and believing it and swallowing it whole long before the internet. I do, though, believe that the more discourse there is, that we're in a process, that we're not in a steady state. Yes, we're in the beginning, and we're having people that are needing to adapt and learn about this new medium and this new potential. Like, did I ever tell you my experience of playing video games online, where you had speakers so that everybody could hear everybody else? And I listened to some very interesting conversations that were world bridging, you know. Uh, but I also experienced a certain category of person who their nervous system just couldn't handle the excitement that this medium represented. And so it was like, if you've ever seen a 3-year-old kid, you remember that toy, Mr. Microphone? And it basically was a little microphone that just blasted out whatever anybody. And if you ever see a 3-year-old kid get a hold of one of those, they can't handle it. It's too hot a medium, to
Too
use
much
McLuhan's
power.
term. Too much power. And what do? They just take the thing and they go rah, 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 until somebody of calmer mind takes the damn thing away from them, right? Well, that was exactly what was happening when I was playing these games online. And you could tell that some of these guys, that's why they made a mute button. Some of them, they just couldn't handle it. The hotness of this, their nervous system just overfired. And we're going to see a lot of that as we see the globalization of the third world, as the third world and the first world fuse, we didn't just do this overnight. There was a development that went through there. And when you try to pull somebody through a bunch of those stages, there's going to be I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying be prepared that there are going to be some rough spots. There's going to be some people that can't handle the power that the modern world gives the average person. And so they're going to get online, they're going to do and say stupid stuff. That's part of the curve thing. But it's like we didn't monitor people and take away the crayons of the kids who, well, maybe the ones who ate them, but we've always had that part of the bell curve, and we've always just kind of had to work it out, and we've been able to. And I think that this also will stratify, and all the people who see the internet as the greatest potential for sharing fart jokes, they will all be in one part of it. And then the people that want to discuss consciousness will be on the other part. And maybe there will be overlaps between them and the fart joke people. I don't know. I'm prepared to be surprised. But the idea is that we're learning this, we're developing, we're growing a global brain, and so there's going to be a lot of noise in there for a while. There's going to be a lot of chatter, but I do think that it's going to sort out, and it is sorting out. And we've seen it long enough now to know that it's sortable. I think so.
Well, that might be an interesting place to leave it because that opens up like this whole potential conversation about what the implications are of growing a global brain, and I'm wanting to ask about McLuhan and all kinds of stuff. So maybe let's talk about those things in our next chat and put a pin in this one.
Sounds good.
Cool. Thank you, Brian. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Onward through the fog.
Yeah.